is Bill Hamilton.
West Belfast, May 1981. 70,000 people attend the funeral of the MP for Fermanagh and South Tyrone, Bobby Sands. He's the first of 10 IRA hunger strikers who are to die in the H blocks of the Maze prison. The provisionals blame Mrs. Thatcher and her government for his death. They say she should have granted the IRA prisoners political status. At the graveside, the IRA pledge revenge for Sands' death. Their response, they say, will be at a time and in a place of their own choosing. Brighton, October 1984. The IRA have chosen the time and the place. It's Thursday night. The Conservative Party conference is drawing to its close. Mrs. Thatcher and the party faithful are in good spirits. Despite warnings about a possible terrorist attack in Britain, the atmosphere at the Grand Hotel is how the Tories want it, totally relaxed. The Thatchers return to their room shortly before midnight. The Prime Minister works for nearly 3 hours on her keynote speech, which she's to deliver to the conference in the morning. At 2:50 a.m. she uses the bathroom and then returns to her room to check one final paper. The time is precisely 2:54. In a split second in the early hours of Friday, October the 12th, 1984, the IRA have achieved their most daring strike on the British mainland. Everywhere there is confusion, panic, appalling suffering. One minute asleep, the next blown out of their beds. Most who've escaped are much too shocked to know what's happened. Some are not so lucky, trapped under tons of falling masonry. Others are dead. The explosion was on the 6th floor. It shot upwards, dislodging a chimney which came crashing down through an entire column of rooms. Mrs. Muriel McLean was in room 629. She was to die later in hospital. Across the corridor in 628, Mrs. Jean Shattuck took the full force of the blast and was killed instantly. Below in 528, Eric Taylor was also dead. So too in 428, Roberta Wakeham, wife of the Tory party's chief whip. And in 328, the MP for Enfield Southgate, Sir Anthony Berry, also died. In room 228, Norman Tebbit, one of Mrs. Thatcher's most senior cabinet colleagues. Firemen took nearly 4 hours to free him. The Prime Minister too escaped, but the devastation in the bathroom she'd used just minutes before and the bedroom in which she'd been working showed just how close the IRA had come to achieving their aim. Within hours, experts had established the bomb had been placed underneath the bath in room 629, and fragments recovered convinced them a long delay timer had been used. In the hunt for clues, 4,000 dustbin loads of debris were taken away for examination. The police had just one real lead. The hotel register was intact. Their job now was to find everyone who'd stayed in room 629 in the previous 3 months. Scores of people were interviewed all round the world. 10 weeks after the explosion, only one guest had not been found. This was his registration card, the name Roy Walsh, but no one had heard of him at the address he gave. Hoping to confirm his hunch that this was the alias of the Brighton bomber, the man in charge of the investigation appeared on BBC's Crime Watch.
Well, the more time that elapses, the more interesting and significant Mr. Walsh becomes.
No one came forward. No one could identify Mr. Walsh's distinctive writing. At Scotland Yard, fingerprint experts got to work on his registration card. Eventually, 2 vital marks emerged. One a palm print, the other the tip of a little finger. 3 months after the explosion at the Grand Hotel, police had positively identified the missing guest Roy Walsh as Patrick Joseph Magee, a Belfast man in his 30s and a well-known member of the IRA. What's more, they'd been wanting to question Magee for the past 5 years about a series of explosions in the London area. His one distinguishing feature, a finger missing on his right hand. Magee had, in fact, slipped into Brighton more than 3 weeks before the Tory conference, one amongst hundreds of passengers arriving on the late morning train from London. All the talk that day was about the weather and football. By September standards, it was a very hot Saturday, ideal for the big game between Brighton and Crystal Palace. Magee made for the taxi rank just outside the station, where he hailed Dennis Palmer's cab. Palmer is a man with a particularly keen eye for detail.
What I remember is the weight of the case. It was so much, you know, it was so heavy compared to the usual cases we pick up for people staying for the weekend. That and the camel hair coat that he was wearing. The fact that it was basically the sunniest day we'd had of the year, and he was wearing a coat where everybody else was basically in their shirt sleeves. Funny enough, when we got to the Grand Hotel, got the porter there that's very sly, and as I said to him jokingly, you better hold on to your nuts with this one, you'll need them.
What the taxi driver didn't realise was that he was carrying 30 pounds of high explosive in the boot of his car. Once in the hotel, Magee paid in cash for a double room. He stayed for 3 days, but none of the staff could identify him, though the night porter had a clear impression there had been a second man in room 629.
After the bar was closed, I had a phone call, and a voice on the phone asked me what I had in the drink line. And so they said that they would have a bottle of vodka and 2 Cokes, which I supplied from my box underneath, then got the waiter to send them up to this room, which was 629 on the 6th floor.
The second man, the hotel staff recall, has never been found. But once Magee was identified, police kept a keen eye on his associates in Belfast. Special branch officers discovered that his wife Eileen, who was still living there, was making monthly trips by train to the Irish Republic. Police in the south were tipped off. They discovered Magee was in Dublin. He was living openly here in the Ballymun housing estate in the north of the city, unaware that he'd been linked with the Brighton Bomb. It was now the police took an enormous gamble. Fearing possible extradition problems, they decided to wait and to watch. They believed the terrorist they'd nicknamed the Chancer would return to Britain. In April, just to ensure Magee's suspicions weren't aroused, Jack Rees of the Sussex Police told the Brighton bombing inquest that the suspect's description was too imprecise to be released. But then, consternation. At Connolly Station, Dublin, there was no further sign of Magee's wife. Intelligence reports said that Magee himself had vanished. As police grew increasingly worried, his picture was circulated amongst special branch officers through a confidential edition of the Police Gazette. That was at the beginning of May. By June, the trail was dead. The waiting game had failed. The police knew they'd lost him. Unnoticed, Magee had slipped back into England. In the shadow of Buckingham Palace, at the height of the Royal Garden Party season, Pat Magee was about to turn hotel guest yet again. The Rubens, with its perfect situation, is looked upon as the ideal hotel by scores of wealthy American and overseas visitors. They pay up to £100 a night for a room in one of the most fashionable spots in the heart of the West End. On the 15th of June, Magee arrived at the hotel half an hour after telephoning to check if a room was available with a palace view. He signed in using the name Morton and giving a Watford address. Then, as at Brighton, Magee paid in cash in advance. The receptionist remembers him eager to part with his £70. He was given a receipt in the normal way. The details of his booking were entered on the hotel's computer. Moving to the porter's desk, he was handed the keys to room 112. The lift was called to take him to the first floor. Magee's one-night stay in this room was to signal the start of what the IRA were hoping would be an even bigger coup than Brighton. The view was ideal, directly opposite the front of the Royal Mews, the back entrance to Buckingham Palace.
Inside his case, Magee pulled out a child's lunchbox. Its contents, the IRA hoped, would spark off the summer bombing campaign. It was packed with pounds of deadly explosive.
This yellow box was a long delay timer, similar to the one used at Brighton. It was already running, and it meant that the explosion could be delayed by up to 48 days. There were also 2 booby traps, a micro switch in the lid and a mercury tilting device. If the box was moved or opened, the bomb would have gone off. This alarm clock gave Magee plenty of time to get out of the hotel before the circuits were switched on. A highly sophisticated bomb. On expert advice, we've altered aspects of its design. Magee's eye was drawn to a bedside cabinet. He eased it away from the wall and placed the box against the skirting board. A perfect fit. All he had to do now was to screw the cabinet back to the wall. It was the ideal hiding place. The next morning, Magee checked out of the Rubens. On the same day, he went to Finsbury Park Station, where he bought a London travel card using the name Alan Woods. That night, in the same name, he booked into the Gloucester Hotel. 4 days later, on the 20th of June, he was still in London. He rented this flat in the East End, paid the landlord 2 months' rent in advance, and introduced himself as Alan Cooper. Under the floorboards, he hid a loaded revolver. The following day, he was dropped near the flat by a minicab driver. 8 months after Brighton, Britain's most wanted man had established a base in the capital, yet 4 miles away, no one at Scotland Yard had the slightest idea where he was or what he was up to. To make matters worse, intelligence from Ireland suggested the IRA, buoyant over their Brighton success, had been gearing themselves for a follow-up strike. In late 1984, special branch detectives raided a remote bungalow near Lusk, 15 miles north of Dublin. The house was empty, but under the floorboards they found sophisticated bomb-making equipment, and there was evidence to suggest similar devices had been moved elsewhere. Sleeping bags were piled up, giving police the clear impression the house was also a training base for bombers. After a series of such finds, surveillance was stepped up on both sides of the Irish Sea. On Friday, June the 21st, a discreet watch was being kept on the arrival of a coal boat at the deserted port of Ayr in southwest Scotland. The man scrambling up the quayside ladder had come in posing as one of the crew. But Peter Sherry was no sailor. The RUC's elite tracker unit E4 had been following him for nearly 2 years, ever since he was released from custody on an attempted murder charge after a supergrass trial had collapsed. Police in Ireland saw him as a link man between Northern Provisionals and the IRA's High Command. They also suspected he was heavily involved in planning a new bombing campaign in Britain. Special branch officers tailed him to the railway station. From Ayr, Sherry caught the London train via Kilmarnock. Police were convinced he was heading for the capital. But when the train stopped at Carlisle, he got off. Sherry wasn't going far. He checked into a hotel. All night his room was watched. Next day he was tailed back to the station. It was a busy Saturday afternoon. On a station bench, a courting couple, seemingly with eyes only for one another. But as Peter Sherry appeared, there were occasional glances in his direction. The couple were actually special branch officers. In the girl's hair, a tiny microphone. Sherry's every movement was being recorded. Just before 3 o'clock, a small bearded man approached. At first, the couple didn't recognize him, but then they spotted his right hand. Part of his little finger was missing. When they looked up, there was no mistaking the face. It was Pat Magee, the man every policeman in Britain was looking for. All attention switched to Magee. But where were the two men going? The undercover officers kept their distance as they crossed the bridge to the northbound platform. As they chatted together, they hadn't the slightest suspicion anyone was watching.
The next train to arrive on platform 3 is the 15:45 to Glasgow.
Sherry and Magee boarded the Glasgow train. And the police trail continued across the border into Scotland. Just after 5, the train pulled into Glasgow Central Station. For a few minutes, the men were lost in the crowd, and then picked up again, heading for a bus. It took them south across the Clyde and into Govan Hill. A short walk, and then the pair disappeared through the entrance of a tenement building in Langside Road. The special branch officers kept watch. At 6 o'clock, Strathclyde police were alerted. Magee had to be lifted. There wasn't a minute to be lost. Plainclothes officers were dispatched immediately. Their job was to watch and wait. For an hour, no one came, no one left. As police kept their eyes trained on number 236, frantic phone calls across the city brought an emergency firearms squad together. But there was a problem. The tenement had 7 flats on 4 levels, and they'd no idea which one Magee was in. At precisely 7:40, 23 officers rushed through the entrance to the flats. 3 men were to cover each door. All were to knock at exactly the same moment. To their astonishment, Magee himself answered the door of the ground floor flat. The hunt for the Brighton bomber was over. He was seized by the arm and thrown out of the house to other officers. More policemen burst into the hallway. They had orders. Everyone in the house had to be arrested. Suddenly, a tall, bearded man wearing a soft cap and jeans emerged from the back kitchen. Under his loose sweater, one officer spotted the handle of a gun. The man, Gerard MacDonald, was whisked into the lounge and pinned against the wall. The gun was an automatic pistol. It was loaded and the safety clip was off. Next to be snatched, a smaller, pale-faced man. It was Peter Sherry, followed by 2 women, both in their 20s, Martina Anderson and Ella O'Dwyer. The raid couldn't have been better timed. The 5 had been sitting down to a meal they'd just cooked in the kitchen. The cell were found to have over £10,000 between them, all in £50 notes. There were false passports, both British and Irish, false driving licenses and donor cards, bomb diagrams, a loaded pistol in Martina Anderson's handbag, and scores of hotel brochures and railway timetables. But the cell's commander, Jerry MacDonald, was carrying the most crucial document. In his money belt, police discovered a bomb calendar. 16 explosions had been planned using long delay bombs. They were to hit London and a dozen seaside resorts at the height of the summer season. The first 9 bombs were to have 24-day delay timers. The other 7 would have exploded after 48 days. One entry was more precise. Returning from the Rubens, Pat Magee noted all the details: date, time and place. Yet it still took police 3 hours to find the bomb. As the police held the IRA unit at Stewart Street Police Station, their job now was to find out how many more bombs might have been planted. The questioning went on for hours, but there were no answers. At the Langside Road flat, they found wigs, sets of matching keys, and the remains of the meal the cell had been enjoying before the unexpected knock at the door. Police ripped up the floorboards, smashed open the walls. Everywhere they found fingerprints, but no explosives. As concern grew, MPs from every resort on the calendar were summoned to Scotland Yard to be told what they could do to help. Thousands of hotels were evacuated and searched. Then another lucky break. A letter found on the cell's commander led police to a house in Willesden Green. There they arrested Donald Craig. He was the cell's man in London. He also proved its weakest link. Craig had been sworn into the IRA just 3 months before. An epileptic and manic depressive, he'd had rows with the others. He hired a getaway car with only 2 doors and rented a safe house with just 1 exit. Now, in his letter, he said he wanted out. While the others stayed silent, Craig confessed his part in the conspiracy and took police to another Glasgow tenement at 17 James Gray Street. Underneath a bath in the cellar, they found plastic bags packed with explosives, detonators, and 15 long delay timers, most of them already set and running. But that wasn't all. They also uncovered rifles from Eastern Europe and indications of further possible targets, a map of Hereford with the headquarters of the SAS marked out, and an article on one of Britain's most decorated soldiers, Major General Peter de la Billière. There were fears, too, for the safety of the Queen. She was due in Brighton on the day of the first explosion and in Great Yarmouth on the day after another. Both visits did go ahead amidst massive security. Even though the cell had been caught, there were still worries about reprisal attacks by the provisionals. A week after their capture, the active service unit was on the move for the last time to face justice in England. Together, they were the most spectacular catch of IRA terrorists there's ever been. Peter Sherry, the man who led police to Glasgow, the planner of the operation. Jerry MacDonnell, who had to put those plans into effect, leading the Glasgow cell. Martina Anderson and Ella O'Dwyer, the women who made the bombs. And the biggest capture of all, Pat Magee. The Belfast man who came so close to killing the Prime Minister was brought up in Norwich. His family moved here when he was 4. Patrick took his first communion at the age of 7. His classmates recall a rather undernourished boy who rarely got up to mischief. His headmaster remembers him well.
A boy who didn't dive into trouble himself, was gullible and very easily led. If the boys together decided on some prank or other, he wouldn't suggest it. They'd be quite willing to follow.
By the time he went to Thomas More Secondary School, he'd started getting into trouble. He was put on probation for shop breaking. By 16, he was in an approved school. Soon after that, he moved back to Belfast, to the Unity Flats, a strongly Republican estate. Recruited as an IRA intelligence officer, in 1973 he was interned in Long Kesh for 2.5 years. After his release, marriage. his bride, Eileen McGreevy. In 1978, their son, Padraig. Magee now featured in the IRA's plans to regroup their dwindling numbers into smaller, safer cells. That same year, a London cell led by Gerard Tuitt bombed an oil storage depot at Canvey Island and a gasworks at Greenwich. Police hunting Tuitt put out a warrant for Magee too. Travelling openly on his Irish passport, Magee left hiding in Ireland for Holland. He'd even had an Irish policeman sign his passport photograph. He lodged near the German border with a Dutch family, learning Dutch from the girls in the house and teaching them English.
At school, my teacher said, oh, how's it possible you talk English with an Irish accent? So I learned much from Pat, and he did it from us.
Magee, who had briefly been at art school back in Norwich, sketched the family. He explained Ireland's history and how the country had been partitioned. Never a hint that he was in the IRA, though he did talk about them.
We had talked about the IRA here, and he told us that everyone in that part of Ireland had something to do with the IRA, but he said the biggest mistake you can make is getting caught. Yeah.
Magee got a job in a metal factory where he's remembered as extremely hard-working. But by now, Dutch police were onto him. They seized him on his way to work. Whilst Dutch supporters demanded his release, Scotland Yard applied for his extradition. From prison, he issued a statement backing the Itch-Blot campaign and went on token hunger strike. In January 1981, the Dutch released him. Britain's evidence was too flimsy. The man security forces now dubbed the Chancer felt safe enough to return to Dublin. There he worked as an illustrator for Sinn Féin on their paper Republican News. In the office entrance, he was shot twice in the leg by a loyalist gunman and taken to the Richmond hospital. There he lay for weeks. Police interviewed him, but no attempt was made to extradite him. Magee's luck never seemed to run out. He had embarrassed British, Dutch, and now Irish police for a second time. Then, in 1983, his most extraordinary escape. He returned to England. Police thought he was involved in a bombing conspiracy. They followed him for days. They photographed him. They chased him. And finally, they lost him. Unbelievably, the pictures they took of him weren't passed on to those trying to identify the Brighton bomber. Nobody had realised the man they'd been following was Pat Magee. Jerry MacDonald led the Glasgow cell, a practiced bomb maker, a Belfast Catholic, but not a likely recruit. His father had served in the British Army, was wounded at Dunkirk, captured and confined along with Eire Neve, and escaped from Stalag 20A in Poland. This his camp identity card. The circumstances of his son's imprisonment were very different. Interned in the early 70s, later jailed for 16 years for possessing explosives. In 1983, MacDonald escaped in the mass IRA breakout from the maze. 2 months later, a soldier and a policeman were killed in the hunt for the kidnapped supermarket boss Don Tidy. Police in the south were after MacDonald too. He was married in Ireland in 1984, left the country for a honeymoon in Sardinia before returning to lead the Glasgow team. A poor choice. It was MacDonald who blundered by having all the bombing targets in his pocket when police broke in. Martina Anderson, factory worker, part-time model, and by 23, an accomplished bomber. Brought up in the Bogside area of Derry in a strongly Republican family, when she was just 10, soldiers shot dead 13 civilians close to the Andersons' house. Bloody Sunday, as it was known, confirmed her family's political sympathies. Today, her home bears a mural to Bobby Sands and the hunger strikers. When she left school, Martina took up modelling. In 1980, the local paper recorded her success in a beauty contest. But she was already involved with the IRA. 3 months later, she was arrested outside a firebomb building. Police say she pulled a gun on them. Held for 9 months, then released on bail, she promptly disappeared. Just across the border, she lived quite openly in this house in County Donegal, despite being on the run. In the Republic, Anderson was taught to make bombs. She fell in love with Paul Kavanagh, who later bombed Harrods in London. Now in jail, he still keeps in touch with her through the columns of Republican news. Ella O'Dwyer was a country girl, brought up among the hills of Tipperary in the south of Ireland. For her, there were no soldiers on street corners or slogans on city walls. The youngest of 5 children, Ella went to a convent school. Then on to University College Dublin studying English. She graduated with honours just 3 years ago. She thought about trying journalism. As a student, she seemed to take no interest in politics, but then the hunger strikes made a lasting impression. She started going to Sinn Féin meetings. Her father is shocked and bewildered that she became a bomber. And how does her mum feel?
It takes it very bad. She takes it very bad.
But you've got no idea what might lie behind it all.
Not an idea in the world, because, as I said before, like, didn't ever think she was connected with anything like that, you know.
Police were surprised too at Ella O'Dwyer. When they picked her up in Glasgow, it took 4 days to find out who she was. A perfect terrorist, committed but anonymous. Peter Sherry epitomised the IRA's ideal, a plausible politician and a willing participant in the armed struggle. Brought up in Dungannon, County Tyrone, he was jailed for armed robbery while still in his teens. In 1982, on the word of a supergrass, he was charged with attempted murder, but the case collapsed and Sherry was released. It was a propaganda triumph for the IRA, and he was given the job of running the local Sinn Féin office.
The votes cast for the candidates are as follows.
The publicity boosted his chances in a council by-election in 1984. He lost, but doubled the Sinn Féin vote.
Sherry Peter, 1607.
That there was an extremely good vote, and we have increased that there by 600 votes. And I think it proved that we're doing a constituency work in the area, and possibly next year we'll have 2,000 votes.
In his manifesto, Sherry had named organisations he claimed were discriminating against nationalists. Soon people were being murdered outside buildings he had listed. A man was shot in this hospital car park. Another who worked at the Crown offices in Dungannon was gunned down. The SAS lay a trap at another place on Sherry's list. They foiled an IRA attack, but a civilian died in the crossfire. Fearing worse to come, the local MP took the unprecedented step of naming Sherry in the House of Commons.
3 people had already been attacked. More people were going to die. I was quite in desperation because it appeared the police were unable to hold him on any of these charges. I felt there was no alternative but to name him. Following that, he did disappear from the scene.
By now, Sherry the politician had adopted a lower profile. The Brighton Bomb had gone off, and Sherry had begun to mastermind the IRA's bid to blitz the British mainland. That bid failed when Sherry led police to this flat in Glasgow. The conspiracy was foiled partly through good intelligence work, partly through sheer good fortune. But in Belfast, the IRA's political wing, Sinn Féin, say it's done nothing to weaken the Provisional's resolve.
The IRA gets on with its work, gets on with its business of removing the British presence from Ireland. And so any loss of an active service unit to the IRA is obviously has to be weighed up, measured, etc. But it has never stopped the IRA in the past, and I doubt very much it will stop the IRA in the future.
Security forces know the IRA can be at their most dangerous when suffering such a blow to their morale. And few politicians will forget the chilling message they issued after Brighton. To Mrs. Thatcher, the IRA said, "You have to be lucky every time. We have to be lucky only once."
Because of that extra news programme, World Cup Grandstand will now start at 10:55, with full live coverage from Mexico as England plays Poland. That's half an hour later than scheduled, as is our next programme, for which we join Ali Mazrui on the trail of religion, discovering the new gods and some of the older ritual ceremonies of the African.